What is it about this idea of communion of God that makes it unique from something that we typically think of when we approach our relationship with God? So what does communion with God mean? And as you write it, friendship with God, what does it mean, and what makes it unique and worth explaining explicitly? Because you're trying to address something that we typically don't address or think about in our relationship with God.
Yeah, so communion is it's a great word. It's a word that the Bible, I think, captures with words like in our translations like fellowship with God, right? God's called us into fellowship with His Son. So communion is a perfectly helpful word. I tweaked it in my title to friendship because I fear that we hear communion and we think something sort of super spiritual, a little bit kind of mystical and off in the ether and something kind of strange. But in reality, I think when you kind of scratch the surface of what Owen is talking about when he describes communion, or what the Bible talks about, with words like fellowship and things like that, really is something pretty close to what we think about with friendship. And so, in terms of the idea, we talk a lot in American evangelical circles about relationship with God, right? We can say like it's not a religion, it's a relationship. Which might be helpful as far as it goes. But I think what's really helpful is this idea that the relationship with God isn't just something that kind of happens accidentally. It's not something that we just sort of stumble into or have to have some kind of higher secret. But it really is at the heart of what God has saved us for, which is He wants to be our friends, and He wants us to be friends with Him. So Owen he sort of defines this communion or friendship as God's communication of Himself to us and our return to Him of that which He approves and accepts. So let's say God, like any friend, God reveals Himself to us. He communicates to us. He speaks to us. And then He's given us some really specific ways that He says, this is how I want you to basically communicate back to me. I want you to be my friend by certain things that He, Owen's language, approves and accepts. So we're not free to sort of make things up and do anything we want to do, but we also don't have to figure it out on our own. God has told us, hey, here are the things I want you to do in order to be my friend, in order to live out that friendship with me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's good. And I think you made a good point when you talked about how so many people have heard the phrase, it's not religion, it's relationship. And we say that often. And like you said, it's helpful whenever we explain what we mean. But I think that people typically don't understand. It's hard for us to know what does this relationship mean. And I think for a lot of people, what they just kind of fall back on is, well, it's an exchange of feelings. Like I go to worship or I read my Bible and I feel good. And I guess that's my relationship with God. But it's not truly what we would describe as a relationship that we have with anyone else, where there's knowledge, where there is revealing of ourselves to the other, and where there's this reciprocal communication like you talked about. And so I think that's what makes what you're doing in this book and Owen's ideas so valuable for the Christian life.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's Owen makes a really helpful distinction early on in the book between our union with God and our communion with God. And he says, look, you have to understand that your union with God is something that He does unilaterally, right? We understand that He saves us. The Holy Spirit unites us to Christ. That's something we don't have any participation in terms of doing anything to make that happen, right? That's something done to us, and no amount of my obedience or discipline or anything like that makes that more or less true, because it all depends on God. So that's our union with God. When it comes to communion with God, that's now a two-way street, right? Like any friendship, there's a give and take, and there's a back and forth, and there actually is something for me to do to participate in that. And if I don't do those things, I'll feel less of that friendship. It doesn't mean that I'm not united to Christ. It doesn't mean God hasn't made me His friend, but we're not actually like living in a friendship in the way that we ought to be, because I'm not sort of doing the things that God has said to do. So, so in that sense, God's made us His friends, but what we're talking about is how do we actually then live out of that relation, out of that identity in a friendship.